Daniel never thought a simple party invitation would change his life, but that night was carved into his memory like a scar. He still remembered the way Asley had walked into the room, her dress hugging her curves just right, her hair falling like a soft curtain around her shoulders. She looked breathtaking, and when their eyes met across the crowded living room, it felt like time stumbled for a heartbeat. Daniel had always been a man of few words, never the one to chase after attention, but Asley made him forget his quiet nature. They weren't strangers. Not anymore. They had spent months dancing on the edges of something real, stealing moments between busy days, late-night calls that stretched into dawn, stolen kisses behind closed doors. Daniel had given her every part of himself, believing, foolishly perhaps, that she felt the same. He believed they were building something unspoken, yet undeniable. But tonight, something felt off. He had noticed it earlier when he tried to hold her hand at the party, and she subtly pulled away, laughing like he had made some silly joke. Maybe she was nervous. Maybe the crowd made her uncomfortable. He told himself that until she opened her mouth and shattered him completely. "Daniel?" Someone called, pulling him back from his thoughts. It was Brian, his oldest friend, holding 2 drinks and nudging him. "Man, you've been staring at her like a lovesick puppy." "Relax." Daniel forced a laugh and took the glass, though the drink burned more bitter than he expected. His eyes drifted back to Asley, standing by the fireplace, surrounded by a few mutual friends. Her cousin Deborah stood beside her, looking far less entertained and far more observant. Deborah's sharp eyes caught his for a second, and she tilted her head slightly, as if reading every unsaid word on his face. Then it happened. One of the guys in the circle, Daniel didn't even catch who it was, asked playfully, "So, Asley, is Daniel your boyfriend or what?" A harmless question, maybe, but her answer, it tore straight through him. "Oh no," Asley replied too quickly, waving her hand like the very idea was absurd. "Daniel's just a friend. A good friend." Her laughter was too bright, too forced, and it rang in his ears louder than the music thumping in the background. Daniel felt his throat tighten. The drink in his hand suddenly felt too heavy, like it carried the weight of her words. Just a friend. He replayed those 3 words in his mind, again and again, like a cruel echo bouncing off the walls of his heart. Every memory they had shared, every soft promise, every lingering glance, reduced to a casual dismissal in front of everyone. Deborah's gaze hadn't left him. She watched him quietly, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something deeper. Pity? Maybe. Or something else he couldn't quite name yet. Brian, oblivious as ever, nudged him again and chuckled. "Tough luck, man. Girls hate labels at parties. Don't take it personally." But how could he not? Daniel excused himself, walking, away from the noise and into the quiet hallway, his chest tightening with every step. He needed air. He needed space to think. Leaning against the wall, he closed his eyes, trying to shut out the roar of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had believed in her. He had imagined a future, maybe not perfect, but honest, real. Was he a fool all along? Before he could lose himself completely in the spiral of doubt, a soft voice broke through the storm in his mind. "She shouldn't have done that to you." Daniel opened his eyes to find Deborah standing a few feet away, her arms crossed, her eyes steady and piercing. She wasn't smiling. There was no playfulness in her tone, only a quiet understanding that felt like a lifeline in a sea of chaos. He searched for words but found none. Deborah stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You deserve better than someone who denies you in public, Daniel." The way she said his name, gently, almost protectively, caught him off guard. For the first time that night, he felt seen, truly seen. Not as a fool in love, not as a friend-zoned dreamer, but as a man who had given his heart to someone unworthy. Asley's laughter still drifted from the living room, but it sounded distant now, fading behind the walls of the moment he shared with Deborah. Daniel met her gaze and, for a fleeting second, wondered if the story he thought was his ending had only just begun. Daniel didn't answer right away. His chest felt heavy, like all the words he wanted to say were chained down by disappointment. He looked at Deborah standing there, her arms still crossed, her expression calm but her eyes filled with something fierce and protective. It caught him off guard. Deborah had always been around, of course, but he never really noticed her until now. Maybe he had been too consumed by Asley to see what had been right in front of him. "I don't know what I expected," Daniel finally said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Maybe I deserved that." Deborah shook her head, her lips tightening as if the thought itself annoyed her. "No," she replied firmly. "You didn't deserve that. Don't ever think you did." Her words hit a small, tender place inside him. He wasn't sure if it was the sincerity in her voice or the fact that someone, at least, seemed to care about the storm raging inside him. He pushed himself off the wall, running a hand through his hair as he tried to steady his breath. "I thought we were something," he admitted, his throat tightening. "She made me believe we were something." Deborah's eyes softened just a little. She took a step closer, enough that he could see the subtle worry lining her face. "You were something, Daniel. You still are. She just didn't have the courage to own it." Her words made too much sense, but they didn't make the sting any less sharp. He felt raw, like his heart had been dragged across glass. The pain wasn't just about embarrassment. It was deeper than that. It was betrayal, disappointment, and foolish hope all tangled together. Deborah hesitated, then reached out and gently placed a hand on his arm. The touch was light but grounding, pulling him away from his spiraling thoughts. "Come outside with me," she said softly. "You need air," and a bit of distance from her laughter. Daniel didn't argue. He followed her through the crowd, past the people who were too busy with their own conversations to notice the quiet devastation on his face. As they stepped out into the cold night air, Daniel inhaled deeply, letting the chill settle over him, like a numbing balm. It helped. A little. They stood on the porch in silence for a moment. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the faint hum of the city at night filled the space between them. Deborah broke the quiet first. "You know," she began, her voice thoughtful, "Asley's always been like that. Afraid of commitment, afraid of being tied down to anything real. She pretends she's free like it's a virtue, but all it really is fear." Daniel glanced at her, studying her profile in the dim light. There was no bitterness in her tone, just quiet disappointment, like someone who had seen the truth long before he did. "You sound like you've seen this before," he said, a trace of bitterness sneaking into his words. Deborah's lips twisted into a slight, knowing smile. "I have," she admitted, "more than once, but tonight, seeing her do it to you, of all people." She trailed off, then shook her head as if chasing away an unpleasant thought. Daniel looked away, staring out at the empty street. "It hurts more than I thought it would," he confessed, his voice low. "She made me believe I mattered." "You do matter," Deborah replied quickly, almost fiercely. Her eyes locked on his, and there was no pity in her gaze, only fire. "Not just to her, not just in this moment. You matter, Daniel." Her words carried a weight he hadn't expected. He felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a small spark fighting against the heavy darkness inside him. For the first time since the party began, Daniel felt something other than pain. He felt seen, not as Asley's shadow, not as the background character in her life, but as a man worthy of more than quiet dismissal. Deborah must have sensed the shift in him, because she offered a small, encouraging smile. "Come on," she said. "Let's walk. Clear your head." They stepped off the porch and into the quiet street, the cool night air wrapping around them as they walked side by side. Daniel didn't know where they were going, but for once, he didn't care. It felt right to leave the noise and the false smiles behind, to find clarity in the silence of the night. As they walked, something inside him began to untangle piece by piece. He wasn't healed, not yet. But with each step away from Asley and each moment beside Deborah, he felt a little less broken, and somewhere deep down, a quiet thought whispered through the fog of his mind. Maybe this wasn't the end of his story. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of a new one. They walked in silence for a while, the city around them calm and hushed, as if giving Daniel the space to sort through the ache inside him. The night air cooled his skin, but his mind still burned with fragments of everything that had happened. He couldn't shake the image of Asley's careless smile, the way she brushed him off like he was no more than a passing acquaintance. It gnawed at him, twisting deeper into his chest with every breath. Deborah walked beside him, not rushing him, not filling the silence with empty words. She just walked, matching his pace, letting him carry his thoughts like heavy stones in his pockets. And somehow, her quiet presence felt more comforting than anything anyone else could have said. Eventually, Daniel broke the silence. "Did you know she was going to do that?" he asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity, as if trying to piece together a puzzle he never saw coming. Deborah took a moment before answering. "I suspected," she admitted quietly. "Asley's always been complicated. She likes attention, but not responsibility. She likes the thrill of being wanted, but when it's time to own up to something real..." She shook her head, her gaze lowering for a brief second. "She runs." Her honesty was sharp, but strangely soothing. Daniel found himself clinging to her words, needing the truth more than the comforting lies he had been feeding himself for months. "I thought I was different," he said, the words tasting bitter as they left his mouth. "I thought I meant something more to her." Deborah's eyes softened with something close to sadness. "You did," she replied, surprising him. "But meaning something and being brave enough to claim it are two different things. Asley isn't brave, Daniel. She never was." They reached a small park at the end of the street. Empty benches sat under tall, swaying trees, their leaves whispering in the breeze. Deborah led him to one of the benches and sat down, patting the space beside her. Daniel hesitated, then sat, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, staring down at his hands. His fingers tightened into fists before he let out a long, tired breath. "I feel like a fool," he confessed. "You're not," Deborah said firmly without hesitation. "You're just a man who loved the wrong person." Her words weren't dressed up to soften the blow. They were blunt but honest, and maybe that was exactly what Daniel needed. He let them sink in, rolling them over in his mind until the sting dulled just a little. Deborah glanced at him, her gaze steady and thoughtful. "Can I tell you something you might not want to hear?" He looked at her, tired but curious. "Go ahead." "She never deserved you," Deborah said, her voice low but sure. "Not your attention, not your loyalty, not your heart. Daniel." Let out a dry laugh, though it lacked any real humor. "Bit late for that now." "Maybe not," she replied, her eyes holding his. "You still have a choice. You still have your dignity, Daniel." Her words stirred something deep inside him, something that had been buried under his hurt and disappointment. He didn't know if it was strength or pride, but it felt like the start of something new, something raw, but real. He looked away, watching as the wind rustled the trees around them. "You know," he said slowly, almost as if he was thinking, aloud, "for months, I planned to give her something special." Deborah's brow lifted slightly. "What do you mean?" Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He hadn't intended to bring it tonight. It was supposed to be for another moment, another night, when everything felt right. But somehow it had ended up in his pocket, like a quiet reminder of all the hope he had built up around Asley. Deborah's eyes flicked to the box, then back to his face. "Is that what I think it is?" He opened it slowly, revealing the delicate ring inside. Simple, elegant, yet meaningful. It had taken him weeks to choose it, imagining how her eyes would light up when she saw it. Instead, tonight she had chosen to pretend he didn't exist. Daniel stared at the ring, his chest tightening. It was for her, he admitted, his voice rough. I was going to ask her to be with me. Officially. No more hiding. No more running. Deborah's expression darkened, but she didn't say anything, right away. Then, after a moment, she spoke with a quiet, firm resolve. Daniel, she said, her eyes not leaving his, maybe it's time you give that ring to someone who would never be ashamed of you. Her meaning was clear. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. For the first time that night, Daniel felt the faintest curve of a real, genuine smile tug at the corner of his mouth. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't an ending after all. Daniel closed the velvet box gently, his fingers lingering on it, as if it still held a weight far heavier than gold and stone. He placed it beside him on the bench, not quite ready to put it away entirely, but no longer clutching it like a lost hope. The night felt colder now, but it wasn't the kind of cold that chilled the skin. It was the cold that settled in the chest when dreams crumbled. Deborah's eyes hadn't left him, her expression steady, patient. She wasn't pushing, wasn't rushing him toward any decision. She just sat there, present in his storm, offering a quiet anchor. You really were going to ask her? She finally asked, her voice softer this time, as though she already knew the answer but wanted to hear it from him. Daniel nodded, a hollow laugh escaping him. Yeah, he admitted. I thought maybe it would make things real. Maybe she'd stop running if she saw how serious I was. Deborah's gaze dropped for a moment, her lashes casting faint shadows on her cheeks. She saw it, Daniel. She said, lifting her eyes back to his. She saw it all along. She just didn't want it. The honesty of her words cut clean through him. But instead of wounding him further, it cleared a fog he hadn't even realized clouded his mind. Deep down, some part of him had always known. He had seen the way Asley hesitated, the way she avoided public affection, the way she flinched at the idea of defining what they were. He had ignored the signs, convincing himself that she just needed time. But time hadn't changed anything. It had only delayed the inevitable. Daniel leaned back against the bench, exhaling slowly. Maybe I was trying to force something that was never real, he murmured. It was real to you, Deborah replied gently. That matters. He turned his head to look at her. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a quiet understanding that felt like balm on an open wound. He hadn't expected her to care this much. Deborah, Asley's cousin, who should have been standing on her side, yet here she was, standing with him instead. You know, he said slowly, a small trace of wonder in his voice. You're not what I expected. Deborah's lips curved into a faint smile. I get that a lot. They sat in silence for a moment, the night settling around them like a shared secret. Then, as if the thought had just found its way to him, Daniel spoke again. You think she'll even care? He asked, bitterness creeping into his tone. About what she said tonight? About how it made me feel? Deborah hesitated only for a breath before answering, her voice calm but sure. No, not right away. Maybe not ever. Asley's too wrapped up in her own game to see the people she hurts. The blunt truth of it was harsh, but it didn't sting as much as Daniel thought it would. In fact, it felt strangely freeing, like a rope had been cut, and for the first time in months, he could finally breathe without choking on false hope. Then, maybe I shouldn't care either, he said, almost to himself. Deborah's eyes softened with approval. Now you're starting to sound like a man who knows his worth. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her this time. There was a quiet, fire in Deborah, something strong and steady that he had overlooked for far too long. She wasn't loud, wasn't showy like Asley, but there was depth in her gaze, in her words, in the way she stayed beside him when she could have walked away. Without overthinking it, Daniel picked up the velvet box again and turned it in his hand. What if I did something reckless? He asked, his tone caught between a question and a challenge. Deborah's brows lifted, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Like what? He opened the box once more, the ring catching the streetlight, with a quiet gleam. His pulse quickened, but not with the nervous dread he had felt earlier at the thought of giving it to Asley. This was something different. Something raw, unscripted. "What if," he said slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, "I gave this to someone who'd never deny me in public? Someone who'd wear it with pride?" The air thickened between them, an unspoken tension sparking like static in the quiet. Deborah's eyes flicked to the ring, then back to him, her expression unreadable for a moment. And then, without breaking his gaze, she said softly, "Then you'd be doing the smartest thing you've done all night." Daniel's chest tightened, but it wasn't pain this time. It was something warmer, something dangerous and exhilarating. "Would you?" he asked, his voice dropping lower, more serious now. "Would you wear it?" Deborah's answer came without hesitation. "Yes," she whispered, her voice steady as a promise. "I would." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. The noise of the city faded, the chill of the night disappeared, and all that remained was the electric pull between them. Maybe it was reckless. Maybe it was too soon. Maybe it was mad. But in that moment, Daniel didn't care about the maybes. He had already lost everything that tied him to Asley's game of shadows. Now he was ready to start something real. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest like it had just remembered how to beat. He searched Deborah's face, looking for even the slightest crack in her calm answer, but all he saw was honesty. There wasn't a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, not a hint of doubt. She meant it. She would wear it. Not because it was a game, not because it was expected, but because she actually wanted to. That simple truth shook him more than Asley's betrayal ever could. For a moment, he said nothing. He just held the box open between them, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones. There was a strange clarity to it all now, like fog lifting after a storm. He realized how tightly he had clung to an illusion with Asley. And now, here stood Deborah, no illusions, no games, just raw honesty laid bare between them. His lips parted, about to speak, but before he could, Deborah broke the silence, her voice quiet, but sure. "I know what you're thinking," she said softly. This is sudden, that it feels crazy." He let out a small breath that was almost a laugh, though it carried the roughness of lingering pain. "It does," he admitted, "but I don't care." Her gaze didn't waver. "Neither do I." That was it. That was all he needed. Without another word, Daniel took the ring from its velvet nest and reached for her hand. Her fingers were warm in the chill night air, her pulse steady beneath her skin. He slid the ring onto her finger, the gesture smooth, natural, as if it had always been meant for her. It fit perfectly. When the ring settled at the base of her finger, Daniel felt something shift inside him. A quiet, powerful click, like the sound of a door unlocking after being bolted shut for too long. Deborah looked down at the ring, then back up at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Looks like it was always mine," she murmured. Daniel's throat tightened, but this time, it wasn't from sorrow. It was something fiercer, something alive. "It should have been," he replied. They sat there for a moment, the weight of what had just happened wrapping around them, not like chains, but like a new kind of gravity pulling them closer. For the first time in months, Daniel didn't feel like he was chasing after someone. He didn't feel like he was begging for scraps of attention. He felt wanted, chosen. It was Deborah who leaned in first, her eyes never leaving his. She kissed him, slow, and sure, without hesitation or apology. It wasn't a kiss of pity. It wasn't to comfort him for what he'd lost. It was a kiss that told him he hadn't lost anything worth keeping in the first place. When she pulled back, her lips curved into a small, teasing smile. "So," she said, her voice light but edged with something warmer. "What do you think Asley will say when she finds out?" Daniel's smile was sharper than before, a flicker of something dangerous dancing in his eyes. "I hope she sees it," he replied without hesitation. I hope she feels it. Deborah's laughter was soft, but rich with satisfaction. Oh, she will, she promised. For a moment, they just sat there, side by side, her hand resting in his, the ring glinting under the streetlight like a quiet declaration of rebellion. It felt right in a way that nothing with Asley ever had. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't a game. It was real. You know, Daniel said after a beat, his tone more thoughtful, she always thought she could do better than me. Deborah's gaze sharpened, her fingers curling slightly around his hand. Then let her keep thinking that, she replied, while you live better without her. A small fire sparked in his chest at her words. Not anger, not revenge exactly. Something cleaner, something stronger. Freedom. Daniel squeezed her hand gently, grounding himself in the moment. He could feel the shift happening, like a tide pulling him away from a rocky shore and toward open waters. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't drowning. He was moving forward. As they stood from the bench, Deborah slid her arm through his with quiet confidence, as if claiming her place beside him without question. They walked back toward the street side by side, but this time Daniel didn't feel like he was walking away from something broken. He felt like he was walking toward something new, something real, and if fate had any sense of timing, he knew it wouldn't be long before Asley saw exactly what she had thrown away. Let her watch. Let her regret. Daniel wasn't looking back anymore. Next morning, Daniel woke up feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Clarity. His mind wasn't fogged with doubts or what-ifs about Asley. For once, he wasn't wondering if she would text him first, or if she would act like he mattered behind closed doors. No. The weight that had pressed on his chest for too long was gone, and in its place was something sharp and clear. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. For a second, he hesitated before picking it up. A part of him still expected to see Asley's name flashing across the screen, as it had so many times before, when she needed attention. But it wasn't her. It was Deborah. Morning. Hope you slept better than you have in weeks. Also, your ring looks great on me. Daniel couldn't help the small grin that tugged at his mouth. Her message was casual, but it carried an edge of playfulness that warmed him in a way he hadn't expected. He replied simply, "Looks better than I ever imagined." Breakfast? The reply came within seconds. "Pick me up in an hour. I want her to see." That line hit him harder than he anticipated. Deborah wasn't just wearing the ring quietly in the shadows. She wanted it seen. She wanted the world, no Asley, to know. Daniel tossed the covers aside, his pulse quickening with a strange, unfamiliar energy. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't revenge exactly. It was something more satisfying. Like the closing of a chapter that had dragged on for far too long. An hour later, he pulled up outside Deborah's place. She stepped out of the door like she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. Her hair was loose, catching the breeze, and she wore a simple black dress that hugged her figure without trying too hard. But what caught his attention, what made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with pain, was her left hand. The ring sparkled in the sunlight, unapologetic and bold. Daniel stepped out of the car, meeting her halfway up the path. Deborah's eyes flicked to his, and without a word, she reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his like it was the most natural thing in the world. He squeezed gently, his chest swelling with something dangerously close to pride. They drove toward the cafe near Asley's usual Saturday hangout. Daniel found himself glancing at Deborah more than at the road. She caught him once, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You keep looking at me like that, and I'll think you actually like me," she teased. "I do," he answered without hesitation. Her smile deepened, her gaze softening but never losing that spark of fire. Good. When they arrived, Daniel could feel it before he even stepped out of the car. The weight of eyes, the invisible threads of gossip already spinning around them. The cafe was busy, as it always was on weekends, and Asley, as if fate had scripted, sat at a table near the front window, laughing over coffee with a few friends. The moment Asley's gaze lifted and landed on them, time seemed to slow. Her laughter caught in her throat, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly as they dropped to Deborah's hand wrapped around Daniel's arm. Her gaze snagged on the ring, and for a heartbeat her expression cracked. It was subtle, but Daniel caught it. The way her lips pressed into a thin line. The quick dart of her eyes to her friends as if making sure they noticed too. Daniel held her gaze as he led Deborah toward a table not far from Asley's, close enough to be seen, close enough for the moment to burn into Asley's memory. Deborah leaned in slightly, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "She sees it." He didn't look away from Asley when he replied, "Good." They sat, and almost immediately, Daniel felt the ripple of tension spreading through the cafe like a silent explosion. Asley's friends tried to cover their curiosity with hushed whispers and sidelong glances, but their efforts were clumsy at best. Asley, however, put on a mask of cold indifference, stirring her coffee with slow, deliberate motions as if the sight of them didn't bother her at all. But Daniel saw the way her fingers tightened around the cup. He saw the storm flickering in her eyes. Deborah played her part flawlessly, her laughter light and genuine as she brushed a stray hair behind her ear, her ring catching the sunlight once more. She wasn't flaunting it out of pettiness. No, it was something far more dangerous. She was living fully in the moment with no shame, no hesitation, and it made her irresistible. For the first time, Daniel realized something brutal and true. Asley had never been the prize. She had been the distraction. Deborah, though, she was the fire he never saw coming. As they finished their coffee, Daniel felt no desire to drag out the moment. He didn't need to humiliate Asley. Her silence, her stiff posture, her forced smile, they were enough. As they stood to leave, Daniel caught Asley's gaze one last time. There was something hollow behind her eyes now, a flicker of regret buried beneath her icy mask. But Daniel? He didn't flinch. He held Deborah's hand tight and walked away, not once looking back. As they stepped out of the cafe, Daniel felt an unexpected lightness in his chest, like the final knot tying him to Asley had snapped clean. The air outside felt fresher, the sun a little brighter, the street a little wider. For the first time in months, he wasn't trapped under her shadow. He walked freely, hand in hand with Deborah, and every step felt like a quiet victory. They didn't speak right away. There wasn't a need to. The tension of the encounter back at the cafe still clung to them, not like a burden, but like an invisible charge in the air. Daniel could feel it pulsing between them, the awareness that something had shifted irreversibly. It wasn't long before Deborah broke the silence, her voice smooth, laced with a confidence that was hard to ignore. "She's fuming right now," she said, a sly smile curving her lips. Daniel chuckled, the sound rough but real. "Let her," he replied, not bothering to hide the satisfaction in his tone. "She made her choice." Deborah squeezed his hand a little tighter. "No, Daniel," she corrected, her eyes shining with a spark of something wilder. "You made yours." There it was. The truth, spoken so simply, yet carrying the weight of every wound, every disappointment, every late-night doubt he had suffered. He had chosen to stop chasing someone who never wanted to be caught. He had chosen to see what was right in front of him, waiting patiently in the wings, never begging for attention but deserving it all along. They kept walking, further from the cafe, from Asley's forced smile and cold glances. Every step felt like a small rebellion against his past, but the day wasn't done with them yet. As they turned a corner, Daniel heard hurried footsteps behind them. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The sound of Asley's heels clicking against the pavement was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. "Daniel!" Her voice cut through the air, sharp and urgent. He stopped, more out of curiosity than anything else, and slowly turned to face her. She was breathless, her expression a tangled mess of defiance and something more fragile. Panic. Deborah didn't release his hand. If anything, Her grip grew firmer, grounding him in the moment. Asley's eyes dropped to their joined hands, then to the ring on Deborah's finger. Her jaw tightened. "Really?" she snapped, her voice laced with disbelief. "You're really doing this? With her?" Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "Looks like it." "You're making a mistake," Asley rushed out, a flicker of desperation creeping into her words. "You think she's different? You think she's better for you?" Deborah, calm as ever, tilted her head slightly, her expression poised. "No," she replied coolly, her voice like velvet over steel. "He doesn't think. He knows." The clarity of her answer knocked the wind out of Asley more effectively than any insult could have. For a moment, her composure cracked, and her eyes darted between them like she was trying to piece together a reality she never believed possible. "You're doing this to get back at me," Asley accused, her voice rising slightly. "This is just revenge." Daniel shook his head, and for the first time since she had wounded him at the party, he felt no sting, no yearning, no ache. Only clean, sharp truth. "No, Asley," he said evenly. "This is me finally moving on from you." Her face tightened, her eyes flashing with something ugly, regret maybe, or the sting of losing control. She had always believed Daniel would stay stuck in her orbit, waiting, hoping, begging for her attention like a dog left in the rain. But he wasn't waiting anymore. Without another word, Asley turned on her heel and stalked away. Her departure, sharp and fast like she couldn't bear the weight of watching them together for a second longer. Daniel watched her go, not with longing, not with sadness, but with a quiet, final sense of release. Deborah let out a breath beside him, a sound that was half relief, half triumph. "Well," she said softly, turning to him with a crooked smile, "I think that's the closure you needed." Daniel's lips twitched into a smile of his own. "It's better than I expected." They stood there for a moment longer, the street around them buzzing with life, untouched by the storm that had just passed between them and Asley. And as Daniel looked at Deborah, really looked at her, he saw not just the woman who had caught him when he fell, but the woman who had helped him rise again. There was no doubt in her eyes, no hesitation, no hidden games, just her. Honest, fierce, unapologetically his. Without thinking, Daniel leaned in and kissed her, slow and deep, a kiss that tasted of endings and beginnings all at once. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, feeling a peace settle into his bones. "Let's not waste another second," he murmured. Deborah's eyes sparkled, not a single one. And just like that, they turned away from the past and walked forward, into something real, into something new, leaving the ashes of old mistakes behind them without a second glance. The days that followed felt like stepping into a life Daniel hadn't known he was allowed to live. No more silent suffering, no more waiting for messages that never came, no more hoping to be chosen by someone who never had the intention to love him back. Each morning with Deborah felt like waking up from a long, cruel dream and finally breathing. Clean air. They kept things simple at first. Quiet breakfasts, long walks, conversations that went deeper than surface smiles and shallow promises. Deborah didn't pretend. She didn't dress up her words or mask her feelings in layers of coldness like Asley always had. With her, everything was real. Everything was clear. One evening, as they sat together on his small balcony watching the sun bleed into the horizon, Daniel found himself glancing at her hand. The ring still caught the light beautifully, as though it belonged there, as though it had never been meant for anyone else. Deborah noticed his gaze and smiled softly. "You keep looking at it." "I like how it looks on you," he admitted without shame. "You sure you don't miss the way it would have looked on her?" she teased, but her tone was light without bitterness. Daniel didn't hesitate. "No," he said, his voice solid. "I only regret not seeing you sooner." There was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes at his words. Not triumph, not conquest. Something warmer. Something like quiet happiness. She reached out and brushed her fingers against his cheek, her touch light, but filled with meaning. I've always been here, she said, her voice gentle. Daniel's chest tightened, not with pain this time, but with something close to awe. He realized in that moment that all along he had been looking at a door that was already open, but he'd been too blinded by Asley's shadow to step through it. You never tried to make me see you, he observed, half in wonder. You just waited. Deborah's smile grew faintly sad, but no less strong. Because I didn't want you to choose me to escape her. I wanted you to choose me because you saw me. He let that truth settle between them, heavy with its own kind of beauty. And he did see her now. Not just as Asley's cousin, not as the comforting voice in his worst moment, but as the woman who had stood quietly at the edge of his chaos, waiting for him to find his way out, and he had. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by a message notification on his phone. He almost ignored it, but curiosity won out. When he checked, he saw Asley's name glowing on the screen. A short, pointed message. So this is real? Daniel stared at it for a breath, then locked the phone and set it aside. He didn't feel the need to answer, not because he wanted to avoid the conversation, but because no reply was the answer she deserved. Let her wonder. Let her live with the consequences of denying him when he had given her everything. Deborah watched him, her expression unreadable for a moment. You're not going to answer? No, Daniel replied simply. She doesn't get that from me anymore. Deborah's eyes softened with quiet approval. She shifted closer, resting her head against his shoulder. Good, she whispered. The sky darkened above them, stars beginning to prick the night like scattered promises. Daniel wrapped an arm around her, holding her close, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't thinking about the past. He wasn't haunted by what-ifs or tortured by regrets. He was here, with Deborah. And it felt right. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic end scene. Just two people, finally stepping out from the wreckage of their pasts and walking toward something better. Something built on honesty, on quiet strength, on seeing each other clearly. As the night settled in, Daniel thought about the way life sometimes works. How it drags you through storms just to lead you to clearer skies. How you can waste so much time chasing someone who will never love you the way you deserve, only to find the right person waiting patiently just beyond your blindness. Deborah turned, her face toward his, her smile small but full of warmth. You think she's watching us right now? Daniel smiled, a slow, easy grin that felt like it belonged to a man finally at peace. Let her watch, he said. And with that, they let the night carry them forward, away from old wounds and into the quiet promise of something new, something theirs, something real.